Anton Fedyashin is professor of history at American University here in Washington. I first asked him about the dynamics of the current China-Russia relationship.
We're living through a tectonic geopolitical shift where Western hegemony after, 400 years roughly is coming to an end. It's being balanced out by rising powers. And the United States is losing the influence that it enjoyed for several decades in the Far East. And the Chinese, as a new rising power, are beginning to demand a say in formulating the rules of the game by which they are playing, both economically and geopolitically and militarily. And so the Russians and the Chinese seem to be coming together and becoming closer to each other than either of them is to Washington. And we don't just have the Trump administration to really thank for this, but also the Obama administration, because it's worth remembering that the TPP was negotiated around China, and that was the beginning of the real economic problems and disagreements between the U.S. and China.
So is the U.S.-China trade war basically pushing Beijing and Moscow into each other's embrace more so?
Very much so. It's actually reinforcing a trend that began with the Ukrainian crisis in 2014 when the Russians were slapped with pretty powerful sanctions by the West. They began to turn towards the Chinese. The Ukrainian crisis and the sanctions in themselves had reinforced what Putin had been trying to do for just under a decade until then, which was his own pivot to Asia, but nothing was happening there until the Ukrainian crisis became a catalyst. And so, yes, the Russians and the Chinese are very effectively and very proactively coming together.
We often talk about geopolitical relations, U.S.-Saudi. These countries also share geographic interests. So when we talk about the DPRK, for example, as a threat of the world, well, both Russia and China share a border with the DPRK, and consequences there can easily have spillover. For years, these two countries, though, have coordinated their counterbalance to the U.S. Do you think we can expect to see more of that and that sort of solidify in the coming years?
Without a doubt. As a matter of fact, the term multilateralism keeps coming up over and over, both during the meetings and in press conferences, but also among journalists who cover Russia-Chinese meetings. And there seems to be a concerted effort by Beijing and Moscow to ensure that Eurasia as a continent is ruled, or rather plays by the rules that are set by the countries that are there to begin with, and that's Russia and China and Europe, of course, but also the Middle East, the new emerging powers. And the United States is slowly being squeezed out as the dominant power, although no one is operating on the illusion that the United States will simply disappear.
We know that Li Keqiang wants to see ag trade increased, and we know that Russia wants to see more investment in Russia from China. How likely is that this meeting will lead to that? We saw that, of course, Xi Jinping was in Moscow in June, and he upgraded ties with Russia. Is this a longer process?
It's a very long-term process, and the question for the Russians is to get as much now, sooner rather than later, as possible, because they understand that sooner or later the tariff spat with the United States will end. There is a gaping hole, for example, in the soybean market in China today that the Russians are unable still to make up compared to what the U.S. supplies. If they have time to move into that market, good for them. But I think they're feeling that the time may be running out. The presidential election is coming up in the United States. God only knows who will win. The Russians expected an enormous amount of Chinese investments to come in after the Western financial sanctions were imposed, but that did not happen. And so the Russians are pushing very hard. But the Chinese are quite reluctant to really open up the floodgate for investment. They're very intelligent about investing in projects that are of immediate national concern to them, and that's mostly logistics in the Far East, but it's not at the level that the Russians want.
All right, Anton, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.